So today's guest is Rosie. Do you want to introduce yourself to everyone, Rosie?
Yeah, I'm Rosie Hayes. I'm co-admin of the Legal Negligence and Mismanagement Campaign Group. You can find us on Facebook, and also of the Divorce, Debt and Litigation Loans group, also on Facebook. And those two groups are basically campaigning to bring a bit more oversight into the way that litigation loans, litigation funding is being sold to vulnerable people. And obviously the divorce group focuses on the way that litigation loans are being sold to vulnerable divorcing people, and generally women. In fact, the litigation loan companies have claimed that they benefit women, although women I've spoken with and who are members of the group would dispute that the benefit has not been something that they've experienced. It's certainly something that the litigation funders have experienced because they get a huge amount of interest, and that the solicitors who are referring their vulnerable clients to these lenders also experience because they get massive legal fees.
Well, I'd never even heard about this until Liz mentioned it
Yeah.
on my last podcast, and well, you know what my comments were. It's just like, oh the hell
Who thought?
came up with this. You know, it's just another way of profiteering off vulnerable, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's another way of profiteering off the vulnerable. And I loved your response because it was just common sense. Who the hell thought of that? And how on earth can they think it can possibly benefit,
Well,
particularly with?
they know that it's not going to benefit. They know that it's gonna cripple them even more because
Yeah,
they're already financially and emotionally broken. So we'll just prey a little bit more on the ones that are already down, isn't it?
yeah. I'll just quickly say they're also selling these things now to the bereaved. So a widow contacted me recently, and the first thing that the lawyers tried to do was sell her a high interest litigation loan secured against the house that her husband had left her, which would mean that this house, which was then debt free, would be encumbered by debt. I mean, they're targeting the vulnerable, actively targeting the vulnerable. And divorce, relationship breakdown, whether or not there's domestic violence or financial or economic abuse, falls into an SRA and Financial Conduct Authority definition of a situational vulnerability. It's self-evident that even the most amicable divorce is a vulnerable time for anyone because your entire life is changing. And even if your divorce is amicable, you're leaving behind all of these sort of dreams and hopes that you had for a future, for a completely different future. People don't get married with the anticipation of divorce. They get married with the anticipation of, walking off into the sunset together. So it's a vulnerable time, even in the best of cases. Just before coming on the podcast, because I wanted to focus particularly on vulnerable people divorcing, and particularly on the way these lenders and the solicitors, and you can only get one of these loans via a family lawyer, have focused on the vulnerable, and particularly vulnerable women. And just to highlight the level of vulnerability, I have to give a warning here. I'm going to talk about suicide. Sorry about that, but it's something that needs to be addressed. So I looked at the statistics,
and that just it cuts deep with me, that one, because
I'm really sorry. I wanted to give a warning
no.
before
It needs to be spoke about because I don't think that any statistics are a true reflection of reality,
Yeah.
and their voices are never going to be heard. And
No.
I went to that place, and it's not, and it does need to be highlighted. So, it needs to be
Yeah.
spoke about.
Deborah, I've been there too, and most of the people in the group. So I've given people a warning, and please, if you're particularly vulnerable, be aware. that this is a difficult subject. There are two real significant drivers, unfortunately, for suicide. One of those is debt, problem debt. And I checked out to make sure that I got the facts right. According to Money and Mental Health org, 420,000 people in problem debt consider taking their own life in England each year. 420,000 each year with problem debt, and more than 100,000 actually attempt suicide. For women and people in situations where there's domestic violence, 3 women a week. I think it's 3 women a week.
Yeah, it is.
Yes, it is, who've experienced domestic violence, and those figures come from Refuge. So I'm quoting figures from reputable sources. In our group of women who have, mainly women actually, there are some men who have been targeted with these debts and have ended up, for some of us, it's been a decade of dealing with the repercussions of these debts. Suicide has been something that, people have been put into mental health debt moratorium breathing space, which is significant because it means that they have been assessed by psychiatrists and by emergency services as at considerable risk of suicide. So if you put, and these lenders are acknowledging, and I'll come to that later, that they are selling these loans deliberately to vulnerable women and to vulnerable people, the most vulnerable divorcees. If you put problem debt together with the issues that come with domestic violence, then you have an absolute cauldron for creating the most appalling mental health outcomes. And a lot, like I say, a lot of the members of our group have been so impacted by this. People have been, whereas solicitors have walked off with huge fees, in some cases £1 million, but don't think that this is just high net worth or sort of medium net worth. One woman in our group, literally she and her husband had marital assets, including in the family home, of 150,000 between them. And she was encouraged to take out a £30,000 litigation loan to basically fight over half of 150,000, so 75,000, and 30,000 of that has already gone to the litigation loan. So she's clearly not going to have anything left to house her and her child. And in addition to that, she's paying interest of 18% on that amount, which is an incredibly high rate of interest. In some of the cases, the interest is as high as 33%. So
Who
came up with this idea?
Yeah, well, there is that, but who actually loans the money? Is it the actual law firm that loans the money?
No, the law firms have relationships with, and quite a lot of them have signed agreements with, litigation funding businesses, litigation finance companies. And some of these are, some of these were just not even Financial Conduct Authority regulated. Some of them only had interim regulation. In my case, the law firm was found to have done no checks whatsoever by the legal ombudsman into whether the firm was regulated and authorised by the Financial Conduct Authority. So you're not even getting the protection necessarily. In some cases, maybe they are, and in some cases, maybe they're not. But what I'm saying is that the lawyers are doing, from my experience, very little due diligence into actually whether this firm is a firm that can be relied on to follow all of the provisions of the Consumer Credit Act and ensure that consumer protections are in place. And actually, some of them absolutely are not. Some of them were peer-to-peer lending companies which have no Consumer Credit Act protections in their loans. They class their loans as non-commercial loans, despite the rates of interest being extremely high. And as a consequence, you get no protections of the Consumer Credit Act at all. So it's going into really murky territory. But one thing that we do know, and obviously anything that I say, I can back up with documentary proof. One thing that we do know is that in 2019, 900 family law firms had signed up with just one litigation loan company called Novitas. 900 firms.
I've heard of them.
Yeah. So some of the firms would have as many as 20, 30 family lawyers, and they were trained by Novitas on how to sell these loans. So one thing that we all came, when we got together, when the group got together and new members started joining, and please, anyone who has a friend or a member of the family or anyone who knows of anyone with any litigation funding agreement in divorce or in bereavement or in medical negligence or in housing disrepair, because these are infecting the whole legal system here in the UK right now, please get in touch, because we're trying to get as much data as we can. Everyone basically clicked that, my God, my lawyers said exactly the same as your lawyers. It's almost as if they're following a script. And then we found, buried in the annual report produced by Novitas, that they had allocated funding to go in-house and train lawyers on exactly what to say. And that's why they were saying the same thing. That's why we were being told the same thing again and again and again. And what they try and do is basically, or what they tried to do, was basically create a little loophole for this particular product. And that is that, okay, so they might be unaffordable loans, which is already pretty bad if you're selling them to incredibly vulnerable people. They might be unaffordable, but the way we're going to get around that is we're going to make sure that anyone who signs one of these contracts is sent for independent legal advice on the loan. Now, in my case, and in the case of another woman who was sold the same loan with the same firm by the same law firm, that independent legal advice literally involved us being frog marched to the family law firm next door and sat down in a reception area and told, sign here, sign here, sign here. Neither of us had more than 10 minutes. It was rushed and it was pressured. The other lady, who had the same law firm, also frog marched next door to the same other law firm, which was a family law firm, so didn't specialize in financial products at all, was just given the documents to sign standing up at the reception desk. So no advice. And then one of the things that's supposed to happen is you're supposed to be able to have your documents that you've just signed, walk away with them, and think about them. And you're supposed to have a cooling off period, which means that you have 2 weeks in which you can change your mind. But if you don't have the documents, you don't know what you've signed. So you can't really exercise your cooling off period rights. So they thought that this was basically their get out of jail free card, this idea that there was independent legal advice on these loans. And I'll quickly go to, like I said, I've been putting together some documents for this morning. I've said some of the lawyers are actually, and the litigation funders have made a point of saying that they're selling to women who are people who are victims of coercive control, domestic abuse. And here I've got a quote from one of the people who runs one of these litigation funding in divorce businesses. And she says that they are particularly relevant where there has been financial or economic abuse or coercive control in a relationship. So she is saying, and this is Ampler Finance, it's online, and I can put a link to this interview with this litigation finance provider. She is saying explicitly, and quite a few of them do, that a litigation loan, a litigation funding agreement, is particularly relevant where there's been financial or economic abuse or coercive control. Now, coercive control is a form of domestic abuse, so they acknowledge they are targeting. They are saying to solicitors, sell these to people who are being abused. Refer people who are being abused to take out
Well,
these.
but basically they are being abusers. That's
In my
simple as
view, in
that.
my view, it is extremely exploitative of the vulnerable and extremely exploitative of the trust that we put into our solicitors. And I did used to trust solicitors. I don't anymore as a consequence of this, but I did. I went in there thinking, well, these are professionals, they're highly qualified, they're regulated, they're going to act in my best interests. And all of us did. I mean, we're all in a very different place a decade on, but all of us.
Why wouldn't you believe? You wouldn't even have you wouldn't even question it, would you? If you've gone somewhere for help legally, then why would you even think that they would basically try and destroy you even further than what you already have been?
Yeah, or put you at
It's,
further risk, certainly. I mean, why would they? Yeah, it certainly puts you at further. It certainly puts you at further risk, and those risks, I will say, have materialised in all the cases of the people in my group. We've got people who were, well, like I described, the lady who literally they had joint assets of 150,000, and she was sold a £30,000 litigation loan, which meant that she lost the house. Of course, there was nowhere for her and her child to live. She has to rent. But in other situations where, they were quite high net worth divorces, and in one, the poor, she's a really lovely woman. She was all over the newspapers about this divorce. It was one of the highest settlements ever awarded. And the solicitors made a lot of mileage out of the fact that they got this brilliant settlement for her, highest settlement, blah, blah, blah. She has never received a penny of that. She has a litigation funding debt of £500,000. And ultimately, she was sleeping in her daughter's boyfriend's back bedroom. So while the lawyers were making hay out of the fact that they got this brilliant settlement for her, as you know, family courts and family court orders are practically unenforceable. And if you try and enforce them, if someone doesn't want to follow them, to a great extent, they don't have to. The route to getting enforcement is long and costly. And if you've got nothing left, because it's all gone on the litigation loan and a 33% interest spiraling away, what do you do when it comes to enforcement? So, and there are quite a lot of, this is not an unusual case in my experience where someone has been promised that if you take out this loan, our brilliant representation will make sure that you and your kids at least have stable living accommodation. You will have a home. And they do not have homes. Most of us have been made homeless by these loans and by the cost of the representation. So they don't work. I mean, they just don't work. I think one of the bees in my bonnet is that there's an awful lot of talk by the family law firms and by the litigation funding companies about how beneficial these are. But there's absolutely no research into where these loans are being targeted and what the outcomes actually are. So I'm relying on all of the people who've contacted me, and it's overwhelmingly negative.
So where do you go from here, Rosie? Is it like, would you have to have is there an inquiry? Is there a complaint going on? What do you do? Wait.
That's a really good question. So we've followed two routes, and both are difficult in terms of complaints. One is to the financial ombudsman. So anyone that you know who has been sold one of these, or who's been referred, I have to be very careful with my language, but who has been referred to take out one of these loans with any of the loan companies, can follow this route. And we're happy to give you pointers and give you assistance, but we can't, unfortunately, do the whole thing because it's quite time consuming. So the financial ombudsman, and this is quite funny. I'll just quickly go back to some of the stuff that I was looking at this morning. So Novitas, and Novitas isn't the only one. There's Novitas, Level, which is the same guys, or a lot of the same guys who were behind Novitas have now opened up another one called Level. Ria Finance, there's one called Plenty. There are quite a few of these sort of jauntily named firms selling what I consider to be a completely vile product. But in 2012, the chief executive of Novitas was saying, courts are actively encouraging people to come to them, to Novitas, with litigation funding, because if they don't, there will be an increase in litigants in person. He said, we're the gold standard. Novitas is the gold standard for litigation funding. And he's sort of bragging about it for years and years and years until it all suddenly comes to a grinding halt. And the first person in our group gets an upheld financial ombudsman decision that finds that the gold standard, Novitas, in litigation funding has been for a decade selling unfair and unaffordable debt to vulnerable people via family solicitors. So suddenly, Novitas closed down to new lending, but the people behind it just went on and opened another business and started selling via that route.
Yeah, of course they did.
My question is, how can this be the gold standard, according to the courts, apparently, according to the solicitors who are writing rave reviews about how wonderful Novitas was, and according to Novitas themselves, the gold standard for litigation finance, litigation funding in divorce, and yet they were selling unfair, unaffordable debt. How did that pass under the radar of all the lawyers who were basically referring clients to this firm? Just gobsmacking, isn't it? So that's one route. The loans are unfair and unaffordable because they can only be paid by selling your family home. And that is the definition, the legal definition of unaffordability. All of these, and that's why they came up with this, okay, go and have some independent legal advice. And then you can't complain that the loan was unfair and unaffordable. Actually, it turns out that we could complain the loans were unfair and unaffordable, and our complaints were supported. And a new complaint has just been uploaded today, again finding in favour of the person who borrowed, who was sold via his family law firm, a huge debt secured against his home. And in that case, his partner was also sold by the same loan company, by a lawyer who is now in prison for fraud relating to this.
Oh my
a
God.
litigation loan. I mean, that's how messy it is. The level of people knew in the legal profession that there was dodgy dealings going on. They must have. The level of that's just one solicitor in jail for fraud relating to these funding agreements, these loan agreements, and it's hard to get a criminal prosecution and to get a solicitor jailed. That's very hard.
What do they do then? Do they offer you do they sort of go on, do they calculate your assets and then do they offer you an amount of money? Or do they just keep letting your legal bills just keep going up and up and up and up? How do they do it?
We did a calculation, or one of the group did a calculation, and she worked out that wherever there was a litigation loan, that in the numbers that we've got, wherever there was a litigation loan, the lawyers and the lenders were going to take a third of the marital assets. So we don't know quite how they're calculating it. One of the litigation lenders that I was researching this morning said that they would not take more than 30% of your settlement. Now, if your settlement is £100,000 to buy a house, imagining that there are still places in the UK where £100,000 would buy you a house, and my arithmetic is rubbish, so correct me if I'm wrong. If they're going to take 30% of your settlement, they're going to leave you with what, 60 grand? There's nowhere in the UK you can buy a house for 60 grand. So what they were doing at this point anyway, at the very beginning, and continue to do at least until 2020, was they would basically tell you to go and get an estate agent appraisal of your home. And then they would lend against the equity in your half of the family home. Now, let's wheel back to the point where they're saying, if there's coercive control and financial or economic abuse, one of these loans is fantastic. What do you think a person who is coercively controlling and economically abusive is going to do if they can control whether or not you can get out of debt? Are they going to go, yeah, sure, I'll do everything I can to help you? Or are they going to go, do you know what? I'm just going to watch you drown. Yeah. And that's been another issue. So the loan is secured against your half of the family home, of the equity in the family home, but you can't sell half a home. You're entirely reliant on the other party in the divorce, who might be abusive, economically, financially, coercively controlling. And in a lot of our cases, when it came to the final hearing and when it came to the final order, you're left with an order that the house has to be sold. But if they don't want to sell it, you can't even list it with estate agents. And that was the position a number of us were in. It's like, okay, I've got this huge debt. The interest is killing me. Every day you're looking at the interest rising. And they're not giving you statements of account, by the way. The money doesn't come to you. First of all, it's held at the litigation finance company, and the lawyers are paid directly into their accounts. Some of them are taking £50,000 in advance. Having done no work, £50,000 in advance, it sits in their account. In my case, that happened. And it was years later when I said, well, what about the interest on that loan, on that money while it was sitting in your account? Surely that's mine. Oh, yeah, we do owe you some interest. So I don't know how many people are owed interest that the lawyers have just swiped. Are they still allowed to do this to date? Yes. Yeah. So Novitas was sold to Close Brothers for 31 million. And we got one of our group got our first, after, I can't tell you how much work this guy put in to getting this decision. I mean, he almost has a PhD in litigation funding agreements now, and got the first decision, which then opened the floodgates a bit. And I got mine, which was favourable as well. The loan was unfair and unaffordable. So then Novitas suddenly decided they were going to close down to new lending. But as I say, the people behind Novitas, who had sold it to Close Brothers for 31 million, had just walked off and opened a new company called Level. And at the moment, there is an investigation into litigation funding. And the guy who is one of the directors of Level, who was one of the directors of Novitas, who is a director of Therium, and who is actually the head honcho on the Association of Litigation Funders, the self-regulatory body for this industry, is sitting on a Civil Justice Commission review into litigation funding. But the only reason that they're doing a review into litigation funding is because it was found in the High Court in one of these cases where it was a group order, similar to the sub-postmaster's case, that the litigation funding agreement was unenforceable, and that meant that the litigation funders couldn't get their money. It's called PACAR. And as a consequence, there was a mad rush by the Conservative government to overturn that High Court ruling so that litigation funders could just carry on as normal. And the Labour government kind of put a stop to that. There is an investigation, there is a report being created by the Civil Justice Commission by a group selected by them. But guess who's doing the report? I mean, it's the litigation funders. It's a guy called Neil Purslow, CEO of Ethereum, former CEO of Novitas, current director of Level, and a guy called, I always want to call him Kevin Bacon, but it's not Kevin Bacon. I think Nigel Bacon, KC, who was the non-executive director of a firm that was very closely linked to and shared directors with Novitas. There are everyone involved pretty much is, well, they've got their snouts in the trough. And so we have approached them and said, it's really important that the people who are being sold these loans set out our experience so that there can be regulation which captures all of this area of finance, because they're selling into such a vulnerable cohort. And we've just been bashed back. It's like, we're not interested in what you have to say. So the whole thing is just being that it's the they're investigating themselves, and they're going to come up with a report that's very favourable to them, obviously, without listening to the problems.
There'll be thousands. I bet there's thousands and thousands out there that we don't know about.
People don't know, and that's one of the issues, and that's one of the reasons I was so keen to come on the podcast, Deborah. People don't know that they've been sold a loan that is unfair and unaffordable. They're still motoring along thinking, well, that was painful, that was expensive, it's over now. I'm sure my solicitors were doing their best, but, I am where I am and I've got to carry on.
So what would they do, Rosie, if they've got an inkling that they have been missold these loans?
Well, pretty much, if you were sold one of the Novitas ones between 2011 and 2022, yeah, you've probably been missold. You've probably been sold an unfair and unaffordable loan. So the first thing to do, I'm not 100%, but all of the people in our group, all of us, unfair. So the first thing you do is you write to Novitas, do a data subject access request. You can get a very easy to fill in form from the Information Commissioner's website to do your data subject access request and make a complaint. So I believe the loan that I was referred to by my solicitors was unfair and unaffordable. There's another side, and I'm as angry as that dog, by the way.
I know. Wait, shut up.
There were two things that they did, which were, and I don't think they're alone in this. I think most of the litigation funding in divorce followed the same pattern and was therefore unfair and unaffordable. And I would have expected that all of the lawyers who benefited from these loans in fees, and some of whom benefited in payments that were hidden from the loan companies on the date that the loans were signed, would get in touch with all of their clients that they know have got these loans and say, hi, in best interest, I just want to let you know that it might be that Novitas or any of the others sold you an unfair and unaffordable loan, and you might be entitled to your interest and charges back. When you're talking about interest, in some cases as high as 33%, those amounts of money that you can get back are really quite high. Because divorce how long is a piece of string? It can last a decade. I've known people whose divorces have lasted a decade. So you can be paying interest for a decade. But even if you're paying interest for only a year, the interest rates are so high that it actually amounts to quite a lot of money. So, for example, that lady with the 150,000 assets who had a litigation loan of 30, she should get back interest of around £12,000. It's not a stupid amount of money. 12,000 is going to give you a bit of a better year going ahead, isn't it? And it would count as, presumably, it would count as part of a divorce settlement. So it's not going to be something that's necessarily taxable. So first of all, you write to the loan company. Secondly, do data subject access requests to the law firm and to the loan company. And then after 6 weeks, whatever their response, upload a complaint to the Financial Ombudsman website. And there's a very good precedent now set at the Financial Ombudsman that in the majority of cases, these loans were unfair and unaffordable. So some people, anyone who hears this, you might get quite a lot of money back, and you deserve it. I mean, if you're struggling along after a divorce, and one of the things I looked at this morning was that women in divorce, our income drops 33% compared to men whose income drops 18% and then rapidly recovers. Women very rarely recover financially from divorce. And if you don't recover financially, it impacts on your kids as well. So this isn't a selfish thing to do. Money matters. It's important. We need it to feed and clothe and house and heat and educate. All of these things. It's fundamental.
But who's being held accountable for allowing this to even happen in first place? Because it's all right getting the money back, but it's the distress, the anger, the distress, the sleepless nights that, you know, these people have been must be worried sick, you know, how they're going to pay these loans back. So who's being held accountable, and also have they had any compensation for it?
So compensation has been minimal. I think the biggest compensation award we've got for distress is about £1,500. And that's from the Financial Ombudsman. Unfortunately, compensation in this country for distress, mental distress, doesn't really, it's very low. They'll give you compensation for financial loss, but they won't give you compensation for the loss of your hopes and dreams and future. You know, you're just going to have to lump that. That's the way it works here. So there's very little. And as far as people being held accountable, none. They've got OBEs, Deborah. I mean, they're being rewarded for doing this. So no, they're not being held accountable. And what really shocked me, once the Financial Ombudsman decision was published, the first one, first of all, they started ringing around people in our group, quickly offering to settle, to stop any further decisions being published, and put the cork on that. Neil Burslow, the guy who was behind Novitas and is behind Ethereum and is the director at level and is right up to here in this, was asked about this at a meeting of the Civil Justice Council just last month, I think it was, and I can put a link up on the site. He was asked about it, and he was asked about the fact that people had been left with unaffordable debt, people had been left homeless and suicidal. And this is the guy who was a director of Novitas. He said, well, that's nothing to do with us. And he's like, but you were a director, come on. And he's like, it's nothing to do with Ethereum, it's nothing to do with us. And then he said, I think it might be to do with Novitas. It's like, well, you should know because you were a director of Novitas. And he was dismissively, oh, you know, it's only a few people. The reason it's only a few people on the website, at the Financial Ombudsman website, is because they rang us round and quickly offered settlements on a take-it-or-leave-it basis.
It should be one person. So what sort of attitude is that for somebody in that position to take?
It's just you don't matter. But you know when we do matter, Deborah, when we do matter is when they're trying to say that they have come in to save vulnerable women and we're riding to your rescue. And they use this. It's been published in an article recently in Legal Futures that, and I said it at the very beginning, they claim that these loans benefit vulnerable women and therefore they are knights in shining armour coming to our rescue. One thing that they don't do, which is so typical of this kind of man, and most of them are men, one of the things they don't do is ask women, was this beneficial? And if they did, maybe they'd find out that no, it wasn't actually. It wasn't beneficial being made homeless. It wasn't beneficial losing my credit score. It wasn't beneficial making it impossible for me to ever get a mortgage. It wasn't beneficial to be in such desperate financial position that I was actually selling furniture to buy my kids' school shoes. I mean, no, it wasn't beneficial, thanks. And that's my story. But it's a lot of our stories too. I mean, we didn't have a
It's
sofa. I
disgraceful. It's
sold the sofa
absolute.
to pay
It's
for
just
my kids'
disgrace.
uniforms. Yeah.
It's
Um,
disgraceful.
so I don't want anyone to ever go through this. I want, and the only way that we've found to address it, because the legal ombudsman and the SRA are doing nothing about this. So you'd think that the financial ombudsman decisions, which are really clear, that the solicitors were selling these loans, that by their definition, the solicitors were selling these loans. The provision of this independent legal advice was not an excuse to ignore the fair and affordable lending law that exists. The only decent advice any solicitor could have given on these loans is, it's unfair and unaffordable, don't sign it. So that was blown out of the water. You'd expect the SRA to turn around and go, seems that over 900 of our regulated firms have been flogging unfair and unaffordable debt to vulnerable people. Maybe we should look into that. But they haven't. And it just goes on. It is getting bigger and bigger. This is, like I said, it started off with group litigation actions and divorce back in 2010, 2011. And it's now expanded to include the bereaved. So your wife or your husband dies. It is now not uncommon for a probate solicitor to say, oh, so I can deal with the estate. How about I sell you a litigation funding agreement at 18% interest, secured against your home? So it's putting widows and widowers in debt. People with medical negligence complaints. So we're talking about people who've been disabled as a consequence of medical negligence. Tell you what, why don't I send you a high interest litigation loan agreement? And that is really going to add to your problems because you've now got disability and debt on top of that. I mean, it is infecting. I call it an infection. Infecting.
How do these people even sleep on a night? That's what I want to know.
Do you know how they
How the
sleep?
hell?
They sleep better than us. They are on feather beds in Zermatt right now. They are sleeping like babies. The people who are not sleeping are the people who are dealing with the repercussions of these really dangerous deaths.
My God.
Yeah, I mean,
It's horrendous.
it is. And all we're asking for in the divorce debt group, but overall, actually, is that this particular area of finance is regulated, right? So what used to happen, this kind of came in to fill the gap when legal aid was whipped away and reduced significantly. And once they did that, they reduced the cap for legal aid so that if you had assets of £6,000 or more, you wouldn't qualify for legal aid, no matter how horrific the circumstances were. So if you were desperately vulnerable, horrifically abused, if you had 6,000 in assets, which might be your car and your telly added together, realistically, I mean, then you didn't qualify for legal aid. But legal aid was always a loan. If you got a financial settlement in divorce, you had to pay it back. And
they put a charge as well, a statutory charge on your property, because it happened to me. Exactly. And the interest on that at that time, I think, was £1.31 per day.
Which adds up over a year. It's 365.
It went over
almost yeah, isn't it? Sorry, my arithmetic is rubbish, and I always have to double check. One of the things, though, about legal aid that is worth pointing out in divorce is that when a solicitor submitted their fees, their invoices and charges, those would be checked by the legal aid agency. And if they were overcharging, the legal aid agency would just say, sorry, we're not paying for that. It's not justified. The difference is with these loans, no one's doing that. No one is checking, are these fees justified? Has this solicitor actually done a reasonable job? And actually, have they done what's necessary, or have they gone crazy and just started charging for all kinds of unnecessary, pointless things? And in our experience, and in my experience, it's been confirmed by the legal ombudsman, yes, the solicitors were charging for completely unnecessary things. So they're just basically padding out the bill because they can see that money. They can see that money sitting there in the funder's bank account, and they know it's going to be very easy to draw down. And the other thing is about the drawdown process, the way the solicitors get the money into their accounts. In some cases, and Novitas is one of those, before the solicitors could get any of the money, you had to sign a drawdown authorization form. So you had to agree, okay, you can get this money from Novitas, right? There are two cases, one in our group and one published on the Financial Ombudsman website, where the signature of the client was clearly forged by the solicitors. So at least there was some control, but not that much, because the solicitors could forge. And in the case published on the Financial Ombudsman website, a solicitor had very evidently forged the signature on the Novitas drawdown request. But in other cases, and in particular in the case of Rate Setter, who was selling their loans around about 2019 publicly, but they were also selling them by sort of agreements with various family law firms, more quietly, not so publicly. They actually didn't even ask for any confirmation that you had agreed to the money being taken. So you can find out years later that they'd taken money during the cooling off period, for example. So you have a statutory 14-day cooling off period where you can pull out of the loan. But obviously during that period, nothing should happen on that loan so that you can walk away if you decide against it. And with Rate Setter, they let people draw down. They let the solicitors draw down without telling the clients on the loan, and let them draw down tens of thousands of pounds without the consent or knowledge of the client, of the borrower. So people had no idea that this money had all been taken. And I find that staggering as well, that they could just help themselves. The deal between the solicitors and the lenders was so close that they just say, oh, we want £50,000. Oh, sure, have it, Don't tell her.
Disgusting.
She doesn't matter. And then you have situations where both... So I've talked about how these loans are targeted at vulnerable women. There's one case in our group where both parties had one of these loans, and they're now good friends and they're co-parenting together really well. They've both had complaints upheld by the Financial Ombudsman. Both of those were Novitas loans. So if you're looking for someone who's acting in that way, you're going to probably find the same sort of behaviour at level. But I've also seen some RIA ones that are pretty dodgy too. There are other circumstances, though, where vulnerable women are effectively harmed by these. And that's where the litigation funders and lawyers are arranging loans for abusive men to take their wives to court in divorce. So while they do like to present themselves as supporting vulnerable women, they have absolutely no qualms, again, about offering these loans and providing funding to men who are abusive, have been found to be abusive. They're quite happy to fund an abusive man's legal claim as well. So they're not quite as squeaky clean as they like to make out. And those loans are concealed quite often from the other side. So a woman can go to court and find out that all of the assets have been depleted because the other side has been provided with a litigation finance loan, a litigation funding loan, by their solicitors without telling her.
Well, do you know what? I really do hope that this podcast has informed, which I'm pretty sure that it will have informed many victims out there that are unaware that this has even happened to them.
Yeah. I think that's one of our,
I think that's why you wanted to do this podcast, to raise that awareness, to make sure that they're not being that this is not still, people are aware to watch out not to fall into that trap, and B, for anybody that has experienced this to report it and get the freedom of information from the solicitor. So I think that it's amazing that you've come on. Yeah, it will have.
Let's
I'm
spread
sure.
the word.
I'm sure, Rosie.
No one's going to protect us. That's the problem. So my only thing to do to stop anyone getting into the situation that I and the rest of my group are in, I don't want anyone to go through this. The only thing we can do is warn. And if you have got one of these or been sold one of these, please get in touch. You can do that by the Legal Negligence and Mismanagement Campaign group on Facebook, or via the Divorce Debt and Litigation Loans group on Facebook. We're campaigning groups. We can't help you with every step of the way, but we can support you. And obviously, we're not charging a penny for this. No one makes any money out of this. We're campaigning groups who are basically all volunteers and victims working together to stop this happening to anyone else.
Yeah.
If we can.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing that. That's mega important that we've got that out there.
I'm really glad.
Yeah. If anybody does want to find out that link, if they want to contact us at Team Resolute support.uk, then we can pass that link on to them, and any other additional information that you've got, Rosie.
I will.
So
I'll put something together so you can send it to people if that's okay.
Fantastic.
Thanks
a lot.
Thanks
Thank you, Rosie.
Really appreciate it.
Bye.
Okay, bye.